Padawan to Archijeth, Hazen was a special case. Unlike his fellow companions, Hazen didn't connect with the Force well, and in a nice way, was considered awkward. During the knighting ceremony, every Jedi was knighted except for Hazen. His compromised abilities and lack of perception made him unfit for knighthood. He stormed out, enraged he wasn't to become a Jedi. A pupil of his, Barristan Dre, came out to console him, but Hazen lashed out at him. Dre was the subject of his envy, having everything he himself wanted: money, honor, and a relationship with Krinda, Hazen's longtime love interest. Barristan forgave Hazen for his behavior and offered the failed Jedi another way to continue serving him. During the Sith War, Hazen would serve his former friend Barristan, but as his assistant, not a Jedi. He was not able to serve directly in battles, and his job was made up of taking care of injured bodies on the battlefield. After the Battle of Tapara, Hazen was confronted by Dosa, a servant of Exar Kun. Dosa teased Hazen about his servitude to Barristan and offered him a way to return as a hero and get whatever he wanted. Hazen, unleashing his anger, then gave in to the dark side, proclaiming he wanted Barristan's life and everything in it. Dosa, pleased, then instructed Hazen to lead a group of Jedi to the Anshari Caverns, a trap intended for the Jedi. After leading Barristan and his team of Jedi into the caverns, telling them that the last Sith base was there, Hazen ran ahead to alert Dosa that the Jedi were coming, but the smuggler betrayed him, detonating the bomb before Hazen could get out of range. The resulting explosion killed Barristan and every other Jedi immediately, but since he was not caught by the brunt of the blast, Hazen survived. His body was salvaged by Dosa, and when he awoke sometime later, in a Sith enclave, he found his injuries more or less healed. His survival, however, came at a horrible price. He was left heavily disfigured and had inhumane prosthetics, along with a replacement eye and 2 new legs. He also had a Sith artifact, the Yoke of Seeming, implanted in his back, allowing his thoughts and feelings to remain clouded. Hazen, when ready to leave, told Dosa he served no one, and he was neither Jedi nor Sith, and proceeded to kill her. No longer a member of the Jedi Order, Hazen returned to the Dre estate and served Krinda, Barristan's wife. She remained unaware of his allegiance, or his partner or husband's death. Krinda would go on to form the First Jedi Covenant, and Hazen would indirectly take part in the training of Krinda's son, Lucien. The failed Jedi would feel for Lucien, as his mother all but abandoned him due to the fact that he inherited more of his father's human traits compared to his mother's Miraluka traits. Krinda would eventually foresee the prophecy of the Five, which depicted the destruction of the Republic and the Jedi Order itself. Little did the Circle know, Hazen would twist the prophecy to fit his own needs. When the rogue Padawan Zane Carrick was finally captured, he was brought to the Dre estate. He was greeted personally by Hazen. While examining the fake Myr talisman Carrick brought, the Jedi Order stormed the estate under Yamar's command. Instead of surrendering, Hazen called all Covenant members, giving them the command Vindication, claiming that the Jedi High Council had been infiltrated by the dark side. While the battle outside raged, the Republic Navy under Admiral Saul Carith's command were hijacked by the Dre servant and fired on the attackers. Hazen then surprised and horrified them all as he withdrew a red lightsaber, revealing his true allegiance. Soon he, not Krinda, was the leader of the Jedi Covenant, pitting the Jedi Knights against one another. Lucien Dre attempted to strike Hazen down, but was knocked away twice by the gauntlet of Kresh the Younger, Hazen's newest Sith toy. A team of Jedi also attempted to do so as well, but the Sith Acolyte made short work of them. As the battle raged, he witnessed Lucien Dre fighting Zane. Zane struck his former master and knelt before him. Hazen, pleased, was caught off guard when Carrick attacked Hazen's robotic arm, retrieving the gauntlet off Hazen's arm. Lucien emerged once more and threw Zane out of the estate and explained to Hazen that they acted out the whole duel so Hazen would lower his guard. Dre took the gauntlet and directed the Republic's bombardment at the Dre estate, killing Hazen in the process. The galaxy never learned of Hazen's brilliance or the true events that occurred that day. In the days that followed, the Republic and the Jedi Order, embarrassed in which they were played, covered it up, instead describing it as a terror plot by the Mandalorians. The man who would one day become the Grand Inquisitor hailed from the planet Utapau, where he was born over 15 years prior to the invasion of Naboo. and became a member of the Jedi Order. As a Jedi, he served in the Jedi Temple Guard, an ancient and honored tradition in the Jedi Order. They became anonymous sentinels and were tasked with the honor of protecting the Jedi Temple, under the command of Jedi Master Sindralik. Unlike many who swore a blind oath to the Order, the Pau'an did not, and struggled with his emotions. These emotions led him close to the dark side, developing a hatred for Jocasta Nu, for whom he would go to the Jedi archives to read data files. He would be watched closely by her, as she deemed him unfit for education. He also began to turn away from the Jedi teachings, and after Barriss Offee attempted to frame fellow Knight Ahsoka Tano for the bombing of the temple, he lost faith in the Jedi Order entirely. At war's end, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, secretly the Dark Lord of the Sith, transformed the Republic into the Galactic Empire, becoming the first Galactic Emperor. For the surviving Temple Guards, they could either embrace the dark side and join the Empire, or die. For the Inquisitor, it was an easy choice. Impressed by his abilities, Darth Sidious soon recruited him to become the Grand Inquisitor of the Inquisitorius. This group was an organization of mysterious Force-sensitive dark-side agents who served directly under the command of Darth Vader. Deemed Imperial Inquisitors, or simply Inquisitors, they were tasked with hunting down the remaining Jedi who had survived Order 66, but more importantly, retrieving any Jedi identified as Force-sensitive. During this time, he honed his skills with the blade, and became very studious, devouring the records of the Jedi Temple in order to better know his enemies. Approximately 5 years before the Battle of Yavin, Imperial Agent Kallus informed the Inquisitor of a new rebel cell with a Jedi in its ranks. Using the remains of Jedi Master Luminara Unduli, he lured the rebels, led by Kanan Jarrus and his apprentice Ezra Bridger, to the Spire, a former Confederate prison. Here the three engaged in a lightsaber battle that raged across the prison. Although Jarrus and Bridger managed to escape, the Inquisitor was relentless and hunted them across the galaxy. After engaging once more in Lothal, the Grand Inquisitor managed to finally capture the elusive Jedi, after Jarrus stayed behind in order for the other rebels to escape. As he was torturing his Jedi prey, the rest of the Ghost crew arrived and stormed Grand Moff Tarkin's flagship, the Sovereign. After being rescued by Jarrus, alongside Bridger, they once more fought the Grand Inquisitor. After making short work of the young Padawan, the Inquisitor was eventually defeated by Jarrus, after he severed his lightsaber in two. Knowing the punishment he would receive for his failure, the Inquisitor told the Jedi that some things were far more frightening than death itself, before letting himself fall into the exploding generator. Before the Great Sith War, Hazen was considered a weakling. He was scrawny and never developed his physical attributes. During this time, his abilities could be considered at best below average. As a Sith, however, Hazen's physical attributes took a much different turn. After the events of the Encheri Caverns, Hazen was left severely injured. His body was heavily disfigured, his skin burned and warped, looking more like Darth Sion than the young Jedi he previously was, and also lost 3 of his original limbs. Instead of a traditional rebuild, Hazen was rebuilt with Sith cybernetics and components. The Sith cybernetics given to Hazen are insinuated by Dosa, a bounty hunter, to be some of the nastiest gadgets available. This implies that at the very least, they surpass the capabilities of that of ordinary prosthetics. To me, I compare them to an ancient version of General Grievous' cybernetics. This allowed him to shrug off traditional weapons, such as blasters and electrostaffs, and yet take hits that he normally would not be able to. His strength was considerable, and most likely his best attribute. He was casually able to lift Zane Carrick, a near fully grown human male with one arm. Perhaps even more impressive, he used his bare hands to strangle Dosa to death. His speed in my eyes is on the same tier as an average Force wielder. He could keep up with 3 Jedi Padawans during the attack on the Dre Estate, and moved so fast that Carrick didn't have time to react. Although the Sith Acolyte has only ever been in one real lightsaber contest, his stamina wasn't tested, even when heavily using his Force powers. This implies his stamina was at least average, able to engage in intense lightsaber contests for a good amount of time, without tiring. His resiliency also has to be noted. After all, surviving an explosion at point-blank range is a fairly impressive feat. Due to the cybernetics he received, Hazen was also taller than most, tower-overing many of his peers. This granted him incredible reach, making it difficult for opponents to get near him. However, what truly makes Hazen's reconstruction interesting were the ancient Sith artifacts implanted in his body, specifically the Yoke of Seeming. This ancient artifact significantly increased his connection to the living force, and allowed him to cloud other Jedi's senses, hiding his true intentions from them. In addition to clouding his intentions, the Yoke transmitted to all Force users the sense of himself that Hazen wished to convey. So while other Jedi could accurately see his truly disfigured form, they would not react too viscerally to it. At his own preference, Hazen could also minimize his effects, as he did often with Lucy and Dre. While it definitely helped Hazen, especially with his connection to the living force, it didn't boost any of his physical attributes. Although heavily disfigured, Hazen still possessed a decent overall physical moveset, and his cybernetics granted him an edge over most normal combatants. The Grand Inquisitor was a Pauan male, roughly more than 50 years of age at the time of his death in Rebels Season 1. Pauans were gaunt, long-limbed humanoids from the outer rim world of Utapau. They had long, lengthy arms and sharp nails, along with sharp, jagged teeth. Pauans also had long lifespans, on average at least a couple of centuries in length. This puts the Grand Inquisitor right in the midst of his physical prime. He stood at a towering 2 meters, and combined with his long arms, gave him an incredible reach. Despite not being the most bulky combatant, the Inquisitor did have significant strength. In one such case, able to halt his opponent's attack completely with one arm. The best display of his strength can be seen in his use of unarmed combat, especially in his kicks. He has done this to Jairus, a fully grown human male, sending him to the ground in their first fight on the Spire, and once again to Jedi High Council member Jocasta Nu, with enough force to send her through the doors in the Jedi Temple. As is the case with most Force wielders in their prime, the Inquisitor's stamina was not hindered, and could contend in high-intensity lightsaber duels for an extended amount of time, all without tiring. For a being with a leaner frame, his durability was also not lacking. He outright tanked Ezra Bridger's energy slingshot, and while the power of it is relatively unknown, we do know it was capable of stunning most of his opponents. Against other Force wielders, he has also been able to eat powerful shots of telekinesis and continue to fight on, doing so against Jocasta Nu, and again from Darth Vader, a being notorious for his application of such an attack. Due to his fighting style, the Grand Inquisitor's best physical traits were his beautiful combination of speed and agility. He used his agility to often gain better positioning on his opponents, often incorporating acrobatics with no difficulty. He also moved well for a man of his stature, and wasn't hampered by his size. His speed in my eyes is what truly makes him a dangerous foe physically. He often dictated the pace in his duels, and combined it with his agility to outmaneuver his opponents. His reflexes were also highly advanced, casually deflecting Ezra's slingshots from behind while distracted. On the whole, the Grand Inquisitor's unique physiology, speed, and reflexes make him a tough physical opponent for nearly anyone. This round is a tad tricky. Both Hazen and the Grand Inquisitor have a select few traits that make them stand out: Hazen's strength, and the Inquisitor's blend of speed and agility. In terms of their strength, Hazen gets the slight edge. His displays in my eyes are slightly more impressive. Lifting an entire human male effortlessly with one arm, and strangling a Nautolan are more impressive to me than landing a physical strike knocking an opponent down. Speed and agility is where the Grand Inquisitor makes up for it, however, as Hazen isn't the most nimble combatant, and isn't bringing anything the Grand Inquisitor can't handle speed-wise. Durability-wise, the two are even, able to shrug off hits that would otherwise incapacitate other beings. What makes this conclusion tricky is Hazen's reconstruction and the Grand Inquisitor's unique physiology. While oftentimes the Inquisitor's reach is such an advantage to him, he will not have this here, as Hazen was also a towering giant. Although oftentimes cybernetics grant a combatant a physical boost, Hazen does not get this luxury. His cybernetics granted him nothing more than extra height, resilience, and increased his connection to the living force, allowing him to cloud other Jedi senses. While the later two definitely help his overall combative viability, this round is based just off physical advantages. And at the end of the day, the height advantage is negated, so is extra resilience enough to give Hazen the advantage? I don't think it is, and in every other aspect are within a hair of each other. No advantage will be given for physical attributes. Hazen is not known for his lightsaber dueling, and for almost his entire life was considered unworthy of wielding the ancient weapon of the Jedi. As a Padawan, he was de-armed by non-Force users, including being on the receiving end of a one-sided beatdown by Dosa. However, by the time Hazen revealed his true intentions during the Vindication arc, he grew immensely as a duelist, killing 3 Jedi at once. In my original analysis of Hazen, in my Hazen vs. Quinlan Voss video, I stated that due to the fact that he indirectly trained Lucien Dre and his lack of experience with the lightsaber, it was a very safe bet that Hazen is skilled in Form 1 Chi-Cho. While today I do see aspects of Form 1 in his style, I don't believe it to be his primary fighting discipline. After his reconstruction, Hazen spent most of his time studying the aspects of the Force and becoming fairly competent in this field. He heavily incorporated these abilities into his lightsaber sequences. All of this lines up directly with a Form 6 user. After all, 9-Man focused on relaxed blade work, designed as a simple, easily mastered fighting form for Jedi who prefer to devote most of their time to study or diplomacy. Not to mention, he has displayed skills in Jar-Kai dual blade fencing, a staple of the form. A hybrid fighting style, 9-Man incorporated elements from the previous forms and balanced out their various specializations. Form 6 covered many of the various moves of lightsaber combat, but due to its emphasis on overall moderation, its focus on blade work was somewhat relaxed. 9-Man was a jack-of-all-trades style, and the success of this form was largely dependent on the practitioner's intuition, improvisation, and creativity. It should be noted that while 9-Man provided no decisive edge in battle, it also had no major flaws. As stated in many of my Versus videos, such as Exar Kun vs Mace Windu, or Kukruk vs Darth Krayt, I explained that I thought 9-Man masters usually came in 3 distinct flavors. Them being, those who studied Form 6 as a supplement to their Force abilities, or focused on another discipline, and truly didn't focus on martial might, such as Johan Othone. Masters who use this style passively, using 9-Man's adaptability to counter an opponent's style, adjusting their technique to suit the needs of the moment. And finally, a user who took all the styles and continuously changed forms in the midst of combat to overwhelm, confuse, and overpower opponents. As stated above, due to Hazen primarily focusing on other aspects, specifically the Force, I believe him to be the first variant. The Dark Jedi used a standard saber cane. Saber canes were a simple variation of the standard lightsaber, merely being a hilt concealed by the handle of a cane. Hazen wielded this saber variant as he was not permitted to use the lightsaber by the Jedi. He built the saber cane to conceal his weapon, practicing in secret and wielding it only when necessary. The saber followed the aesthetic of his grizzly prosthetics, and also featured a slight curve, which allowed for more precise movements, as well as near-perfect flexibility when engaged in lightsaber combat. Powering the weapon was a single red synthetic crystal. This gave the blade more cutting power at the expense of maneuverability. Before and during the Sith War, Hazen was undisciplined and predictable in his actions, to both friend and foe. According to Master Arkajeth, he was unfocused and haphazard in his pursuits, allowing his emotions to constantly get the better of him. Ironically enough, this all changed after his fall to the dark side, and he no longer resembled the fighter he used to be. Instead, he was cunning, calculated, and ruthless. Offensively, Hazen relied heavily on his Force powers. His first move is to always overwhelm his opponent with his Force attacks, usually torrents of Force lightning, only using his blade when an opponent got past his initial attack. In keeping with Form 6 philosophy, his blade work is somewhat relaxed, but it was also direct and strategic. Hazen may not throw a ton of lightsaber strikes to overwhelm his foe, but when he does strike, it is calculated and often with deadly intentions. Defensively, the Dark Jedi once again often relied on his Force powers. He will parry an incoming strike and then immediately counterattack with a Force push, or lightning, where he can once more attempt to submit his foe. Hazen's overall skill with the blade is a bit tricky to figure out, since he's only truly been seen in one intense lightsaber duel as a Sith Acolyte. In that fight, he quickly dispatched 3 Jedi with ease. As an overall lightsaber duelist, I find him to be average, at best comparable to that of a standard Jedi Knight. At the end of the day, Hazen honestly should be given a ton of credit for how far of a jump he took, molding himself into a competent combatant. He has a solid understanding of lightsaber combat, as shown in his training of Lucien Dre. His training also shows how much he values textbook implementation, as Dre is the poster boy for textbook Form 1, employing a high-volume sweeping attack style while leaving his defenses exposed. The major issue for Hazen is without his use of the Force, his application is standard and easily recognizable. He knows what he knows, and that's textbook maneuvers, and not a lot of improvisation or any of the unorthodox. While a solid lightsaber duelist, he wouldn't be fooling anyone, and against the right opponent, his style would be picked apart and his weaknesses exposed. The Grand Inquisitor was considered to be one of the most prolific Jedi hunters of his time. Considered an expert on Jedi, second only to Darth Vader, it should come to no surprise he has an extensive list of kills under his belt. He has spent years perfecting his style, learning from some of the best, originally as a Temple Guard under the tutelage of the respected Jedi Battlemaster Sindralik, and then later as a Darksider, under one of the best duelists in galactic history, Darth Vader. While his style is never stated, there is enough present where I feel comfortable in my analysis. Originally, as a Temple Guard, I believe he focused on Form 2 Makashi. Form 2 Makashi was developed for the purpose of lightsaber-to-lightsaber combat. Described as elegant and focused, Makashi was based on balance and footwork to outmaneuver opponents. Fluidity, precision, and economy of motion were relied on, rather than strength, with Form 2's blade work heavily utilizing jabs and light cuts, rather than hacks and slashes. However, come his turn to the dark side, he heavily began to study all forms of combat, to the point where he had extensive knowledge of all forms of lightsaber combat. The Grand Inquisitor learned these forms inside and out, so much so that he could use them efficiently, and yet also knew the most effective way to counter all of them. Because of this, I feel he primarily employed Form 6 9-Man. Form 6 covered many of the various moves of lightsaber combat, but due to his emphasis on overall moderation, its focus on blade work was somewhat relaxed. 9-Man was a jack-of-all-trades style, and the success of the form was largely dependent on the practitioner's intuition, improvisation, and creativity. It should also be noted that while 9-Man provided no decisive edge in battle, it also had no major flaws. As stated earlier in this video, I explained that I thought 9-Man Masters usually came in 3 distinct flavors. Them being those who studied Form 6 as a supplement to their Force abilities, or focused on another discipline, and didn't truly focus on martial might, such as Johann Othon. Masters who used the style passively, using 9-Man's adaptability to counter an opponent's style, adjusting their techniques to suit the needs of a moment. And finally, a user who took control of all the styles, and consistently changed forms in the midst of combat to overwhelm, confuse, and overpower opponents. The Grand Inquisitor, in my eyes, is the rare second variant. In combat, the Grand Inquisitor utilized one of the most unique lightsabers in galactic history. The weapon featured a ranged emitter, which could partially detach from the hand grip in the center, allowing the twin blades to rotate rapidly, without effort from the wielder. This function likely served as a way to intimidate, or off-balance his opponents. However, this design did leave the weapon open to damage, which could cause the weapon to malfunction, such as when Kanan and Jarrus did so in their final duel. Powering this weapon were 2 bled Kyber crystals. These crystals gave the weapon its signature red color, but also had no major advantages or disadvantages. His skill with the blade was so well respected that Darth Sidious himself personally picked him to be the Grand Inquisitor. Offensively, he had 3 different approaches, the first of which being a Makashi-centered approach. Here he analyzes an opponent's style, and attempts to dissect it with the dueling-centric form. However, I also agree with Rico Chico Maliko, who goes on to state,
but it could also be argued that he did this as he viewed it as a necessary counter to Kanan's use of Form 3, so it is also possible that he opens with whichever style he deems most appropriate for his opponents.
An idea that I agree with. By the way, if you aren't subbed to him, go do it right now. If this initial approach did not work, he would switch up his style and ignite the second blade of his saber staff. The Grand Inquisitor would use a relatively standard 9-Man style here, using the extra blade to surprise and off-balance his opponents, while also giving him the most versatility in case his foe switches their style drastically. And finally, when pitted against an opponent he couldn't defeat outright, he resorted to the spinning function of his weapon. Here he employed a much more up-tempo version of his standard double-bladed approach, but also with more unorthodox methods, using all the different forms in an attempt to overwhelm his opponent. His defensive style was also determined by which style he was implementing, that being his single or double-bladed approaches. With the single blade, and using his Makashi style, he wouldn't attempt to stonewall his opponents, instead relying on redirection and deflection, parrying a strike, and then using his enemy's own movement against them. He'd also incorporate the footwork of Makashi to outmaneuver and embarrass his attacker. With both blades out, he would use the acrobatics of Ataro to attempt to regain better positioning, as well as pairing a strike with one blade before immediately counterattacking with the other. Sticking with the teachings of his preferred form, the Grand Inquisitor loves incorporating force-based attacks into his lightsaber sequences. When an opening is available, and his blade isn't available, he usually capitalizes with a force push, once more giving him the upper hand. Tactically, he was very impressive. Due to his extensive hours studying, the Grand Inquisitor only needed a short time analyzing his opponent's style before leading his forces with an appropriate response. He has shown the ability to do this on the battlefield against rebel forces, but more often than not, against Jedi. His tactical mind was so proficient that it only took 10.6 seconds to identify a Jedi's fighting style, as well as in some cases the exact master in which they trained under. The Pau'an also like to employ mind games in the midst of a duel, employing psychological warfare, especially Dun Mok. Dun Mok was a discipline which commonly involves spoken taunts or jeers, able to expose the opponent's hidden inner weaknesses or doubts. This often resulted in eroding his opponent's will. These attacks also could help strip one's connection to the Force, making his opponents less precise and effective. While no doubt a skilled lightsaber practitioner, the Grand Inquisitor's mind was often more advanced than his skill. The best comparison I have is to that of a football player with a high IQ for the game, but lacks the physical ability and natural talent to execute such plays at a high level. This is not to say he is bad, because he's a notorious killer, but his skill lies primarily in his mind, and master-level combatants would have their way with him. On the whole, the Grand Inquisitor was a very skilled lightsaber combatant, and rightfully so, was placed in a tier alongside the greatest Jedi hunters of all time. This round is very clear. While both Hazen and the Grand Inquisitor are talented duelists, only one truly stands out. The Grand Inquisitor was bred for martial combat, and has had years of perfecting his style, making him a very difficult outing for anyone of Hazen's caliber. Hazen, on the contrary, wasn't a martial artist first and foremost, instead, focusing his time on learning the darkest secrets the Sith had to offer. Not to mention, for almost Hazen's entire life, was considered unworthy of even wielding a lightsaber. As I stated earlier, however, compared to his Padawan showings, Hazen should be given immense amount of credit for how far of a jump he took. Unfortunately for him, without his force powers, his blade work is relaxed and textbook in nature, a perfect recipe for disaster against someone like the Grand Inquisitor. Not only are the Grand Inquisitor's skills superior to Hazen's, but if Hazen sticks with his normal approach, the Grand Inquisitor will spot all the weaknesses and exploit them in seconds. On top of all this, if the Grand Inquisitor goes to his third and final approach, it is incredibly unique and unorthodox, something Hazen would likely have never seen before. With Hazen's lack of dueling experience as well, I'm not sure he'd be able to adapt very well. While Hazen may also be deceptive in his tactics, they're average, and they lack the Inquisitors by a mile. And, to be honest, it's not even really close. Even if Hazen leads with his blade, his technique isn't anything out of the ordinary, nothing the Inquisitor can't figure out and counter. At the end of the day, the Grand Inquisitor was bred for martial combat against other trained Force wielders. Paired with his extensive knowledge, and Hazen's lack of experience and adaptability, give him an advantage. The Grand Inquisitor gets the edge. As a Jedi, Hazen's Force abilities were weak at best, described as awkward. The living Force didn't flow through him normally as it did other Jedi, and this flaw was often considered a disability. However, after his reconstruction, his body was implanted with various Sith artifacts and equipment, which in turn enhanced his Force abilities and allowed him to compensate for this disability. Although never stated, it is very likely that Hazen was able to augment his physical traits using the Force, as it is a skill that even the most novice Force wielders learn. This allowed the Sith Acolyte to move at incredible speeds, increase his strength, and finally, hold up in intense lightsaber duels. In terms of telekinesis, Hazen has only shown basic skill in its use. While not able to throw around large objects with ease, he was able to move smaller objects with no difficulty, such as moving lightsabers to and from certain individuals, like he did with Lucien Dre and Zane Carrick. I also personally feel he would be able to do this against a Force wielder in battle. While not able to manhandle them or ragdoll them, I do believe if he landed a shot, his opponent would at least get thrown back. Telepathy was one of the few fields that Hazen stood out in. Like most Force wielders, he was skilled in the classic Jedi mind trick. And while not possessing the ability to outright dominate the minds of others, such as Darth Barris, Hazen was still able to influence the minds of other powerful beings. The most notable example of this being when he influenced a master-level Jedi in Lucien Dre into doing his bidding. Hazen's telepathic improvements were due in part to the artifact implanted in him, the Yoke of Seeming, which clouded the Jedi's perception of his intentions and true nature, allowing him to live amongst them without being discovered as a Sith acolyte for many years. It also allowed him to influence the minds of all around him, to appear as anything or anyone he wanted to, hiding his disfigured body. Hazen's most prolific offensive Force ability was his use of Force Lightning. Force Lightning was a purely offensive, energy-based attack that channeled Force energy down the user's limbs, hurling arcing bolts of electricity from the wielder's fingertips or palms. Hazen heavily favored this in combat, and it had the power to kill. While his level of this ability is unknown, I feel it to be fairly advanced. In the comic arc Star Wars Empire Betrayal, it is stated that powerful discharges would branch out into dozens of smaller forks. Thus, skilled practitioners could target several foes at once. Hazen displayed this when he wiped the floor with a team of Jedi storming the Dre estate. Another thing worth noting is that the Jedi have their lightsabers equipped here, but are unable to defend themselves against the attack. Hazen's most obscure and dangerous ability were his skills in the ancient art of Sith sorcery. By those against whom it was used, Sith sorcery was described as the full destructive power of the dark side. Its strength was derived from negative emotions, and grew stronger and more corrupting with each expression. Sith magic was every bit a part of the dark side as conventional Force powers, such as telekinesis and lightning. While most sorcerers learned spells such as Darth Zana, Hazen instead learned the art in an effort to unlock the hidden abilities of his artifacts. The best example of this can be seen in his use of the Gauntlet of Kresh the Onger. The Gauntlet was a Sith artifact created during the time of the Old Sith Empire by the Sith Lord Ludo Kresh to make his son invincible. Worn on the user's forearm, the Gauntlet had the power to prevent anything from touching the wearer without his or her consent, blasting aside anything that attempted to do so with a surge of dark side energy. Hazen's knowledge of sorcery allowed him to unlock the power of the artifact, able to repel any threat that came too close to him without his consent, such as he did to Jedi Master Lucien Dre multiple times. This power allowed him to be near untouchable, and had he not been tricked by Dre and Carrick into lowering his guard, who knows how much damage he truly could have caused. For this contest, however, we will not be giving him the Gauntlet, as the Grand Inquisitor would have no chance in this contest. The Dark Jedi's skill in this field also granted him immense knowledge on many Sith artifacts, so much so that he was able to discern the fake Mer talisman worn by Zane Carrick from the genuine one. This despite Jedi Masters Lucien and Quinala being unable to do so. His use of the Force also followed the mold of many Sith. He was direct and overwhelming. He always looked to unleash the might of his full power, the best example being his use of Force Lightning, sending waves at a time and never a slight torrent here or there. At the end of the day, despite his disability with the Force, Hazen was still a tough outing. His Sith artifacts greatly boosted his use of the Force, and his knowledge of it made him a very, very dangerous adversary. Despite primarily being a martial artist, the Grand Inquisitor still displayed some significant prowess with the Force. He had enough skill in this field that Kanan Jarrus stated the Inquisitor emanated the dark side. As is the case with Hazen, although never stated, it is very likely that the Inquisitor was able to augment his physical traits using the Force, as it is a skill even the most novice Force wielders learn. This allowed the leader of the Inquisitorius to move at incredible speed, perform Force-assisted acrobatics, and finally, hold up in intense lightsaber duels against fugitive Jedi. The Grand Inquisitor's main move in combat was telekinesis. He was able to lift and throw large objects around with ease, and even rip through the shields of other trained Force wielders. He has done this on multiple occasions, sending Kanan flying in many of their duels. Although his overall power in this field isn't confirmed, he is stronger than Kanan during Rebels Season 1, who at this point was able to hold up a small cave from collapsing, signifying the Inquisitor had no trouble moving large objects. Much like Count Dooku, the Grand Inquisitor employed telekinesis both subtly and directly. On multiple occasions he would subvert his opponents, and then when they least expect it, disarm them. And when he needed to, he would unleash his full power, such as when he ragdolled multiple Phrynox in the abandoned fort in Naxxes, as well as pinning Kanan against a wall for a solid amount of time during their last duel in Lothal. During a vision of Ezra's, the Grand Inquisitor was also seen using the Force Choke ability. Although this was during a vision, I believe he could employ such an attack normally, This is due to the fact that Force Choke was a staple in most Darksiders' movesets. Not to mention, if someone as raw as Savage Opress, and even the Jedi Youngling Caliphor were able to employ such an attack with little to no training, I think it's safe to say a scholar such as the Grand Inquisitor can use such an attack. An obscure ability the Inquisitor commonly employed was the lightsaber throw technique. He heavily favored this attack, in one instance looking like Patrick Mahomes and chucking the saber a vast distance at Kanan and Ezra. As a telepath, the Grand Inquisitor was very capable. Like many trained Force wielders, he was skilled in the Jedi mind trick and could rip information from the minds of others. This definitely came to use in one of the Inquisitor's main tasks, that being as an interrogator, attempting to break the minds of the Jedi he captures in an attempt to lure out remaining knights or rebel cells. He also had a very strong Force sense, in one case able to sense Kanan Jarrus and Ezra Bridger's presence on the asteroid PM1203 from across the galaxy. He has also shown a decent level of defense against Force attacks, in one case swatting off an attack from Ezra as if it were a gentle breeze. With that said, his defenses were compromised by Kanan when he wasn't expecting it, showing like many, he is still susceptible to an attack if timed and placed correctly. At the end of the day, the Grand Inquisitor's Force abilities are meh at best. This makes sense, however, as he wasn't trained to be a true Sith, and Palpatine and Vader would never give their knowledge to just any old Inquisitor. He featured a skill set of a basic Dark Jedi, but took what he had and made the best of it. As is the case with the previous rounds, I think this one is pretty straightforward. Despite the fact that neither combatants were trained as true Sith, they are both competent Darkside users. However, only one truly learned true Darkside aspects and embraced its teachings. In terms of telekinesis, I'd say the pair are almost equals, as both can move objects around with little to no difficulty, as well as use the attack against other Force wielders. However, the Grand Inquisitor gets the slight edge here, as he can employ telekinesis in a multitude of ways, subverting his opponents with its use, or unleashing his full power, whereas Hazen only does so in a very direct manner. The Inquisitor can also use telekinesis for Force-based strangulation, something Hazen has never been seen employing, as well as the lightsaber throw ability. Luckily for him, however, this is the only advantage I see the Inquisitor holding over Hazen. In telepathy, Hazen gets the edge. While the Inquisitor has been able to influence and rip information from the minds of others, he has only done so against low-level knights. Hazen, on the contrary, was able to influence the minds of all around him into ignoring his physical deformations. Not to mention, he has been able to influence the minds of master-level combatants, including Jedi High Council members such as Lucien Dre. After telekinesis and telepathy, the Inquisitor really doesn't have anything he can bring to the table. We haven't even gotten to Hazen's advanced display of lightning, something the Inquisitor, minus his lightsaber, has no true defense for. In my previous analysis of Hazen, I state I believe he won the Force round due to his knowledge of Sith sorcery. While it is no doubt very impressive that he has knowledge in this field, he can really only use it combatively in conjunction with some of his Sith artifacts, such as the Gauntlet of Kresh the Younger. And as already stated, he will not have them here, and without them, he can't use sorcery in combat, unlike sorcerers such as Darth Zana. Despite this, Hazen's knowledge of the Force far surpassed that of the Grand Inquisitor, and on top of that, he has more dangerous abilities at his disposal, primarily his Force lightning. The Inquisitor uses what he has well for the most part, but he was never trained in any true Darkside abilities. Hazen's knowledge of the Darkside, along with having more abilities at his disposal, grant him a decisive edge over the Inquisitor. Hazen gets the edge. And finally, we've reached the verdict. If these two Darkside warriors came up against each other on the battlefield, who would win? Let's set up this fight. Let's say it takes place in the Theed hangar, with the winner winning a solid 7 out of 10 times. The two would cross paths, the Inquisitor walking towards the doors, but before he could, they'd open, and Hazen would emerge. The Inquisitor would open with some late banter, attempting to achieve Doomlock early. Finally, having enough, Hazen would ignite his lightsaber and send torrents of lightning towards the Grand Inquisitor. Just in the nick of time, his opponent ignited his blade and managed to absorb the attack before it could connect. The Inquisitor then began to march forward, yet every time he attempted to do so, Hazen would return with an attack, not allowing him to get close. The early fight goes to Hazen, who would constantly attempt to off-balance his opponents with his superiority in the Force. At first, this would work, lightning being an attack the Inquisitor hasn't had to defend against before, in turn making him sit back and attempt to work his way in slowly, making sure not to overextend himself. Hazen would be content here, hoping to get the killing blow without engaging his opponent directly. The early fight would end once the Grand Inquisitor began to put together the different sequences that Hazen was putting together. He now was pushing forward, and finally was able to engage with his lightsaber. In less than a minute, he began to understand Hazen's style, and recognize it as Form 6. He would stick with his Makashi-centered approach, as he knew the dueling-centric form would allow him the best opportunity to strike through Hazen's relaxed blade work. Hazen would block one strike with his blade, and then counter with a force attack. By now, however, the Inquisitor was picking up on the pattern, and his attacks didn't have the same efficiency that they had early in the fight. I give the mid-fight to the Grand Inquisitor. Once he manages to make his way into Hazen's guard, he will begin to start mounting his own offensive. Not to mention, his tactical mind would begin to piece together Hazen's attack patterns, and he was no longer strictly on the defensive analyzing. The end fight would also be the Inquisitor's. Hazen, after not making much ground, finally managed to land a force push, which pushed the Inquisitor across the hangar. Smiling, the Inquisitor ignites the second blade of his weapon, and goes straight into kill mode. He was utilizing his third attack style, with his blade spinning rapidly. Hazen was caught off guard, and began desperately attempting to hold back. However, none of his counters were working. The Grand Inquisitor was relentless, and now he knew Hazen's attacks. Hazen, recognizing he was being pushed back, attempted to unleash his power. He parried an attack and reached out with his hand, but instead of lightning, he was meted with a red blade, which severed his one good hand from his body. He dropped before the Grand Inquisitor, who delivered the killing blow. The ultimate determining factor for this match comes down to either the Inquisitor's martial advantage or Hazen's force advantage. Each advantage is a large one, but who is more likely to take advantage? Hazen can win this if his lightning manages to connect, but after that, can he muster up anything that can really deliver a killing blow? The Inquisitor is too smart, and he will not rush in until he knows how to defend himself properly. Once the Inquisitor turns it on, and begins countering, however, Hazen is at a severe disadvantage, as his style will be recognized, and once the Inquisitor begins to use unorthodox methods, he is set even further back. In the end, the Inquisitor's martial advantage surpasses Hazen's force edge, and in turn, gives him the victory. I declare, the Grand Inquisitor, the fallen Jedi Temple Guard, the victor.